All right, here we go. We're live. We're live now. Hi, everybody. It's Pastor Kevin again, and I'm joined by Pastor Omair, and we have a very special guest today. Who is this little buddy?
That's Omair Jr. That's two Omairs for the price of one.
Two Omairs for the price of one. Yes, this is Omair Jr. So delighted that he's going to join us because he is going to be the recipient of all this great wisdom and knowledge regarding technology and iPads and social media and personal digital devices, aren't you, Omair? Yeah, that's right. Exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah. He will be here until it's his bedtime.
That's right. Well, thank you so much, Omair, for joining us. For everybody that's joining online, thank you so much for joining us for this last of our series of conversations for disrupted times. We've been talking about spiritual disciplines with Pastor Danielle. We talked about the medical perspective with Dr. Dave Chen. We talked about a financial perspective with Pastor Tom, and then this last Tuesday we talked about storytelling with Siddhi Sundar, which was all of these conversations have been incredible. So today we're going to talk about technology, and let me, I guess, preface this by saying that Omair is one of my favorite conversational partners. He thinks about things deeply, and whenever we start engaging, it's just so much fun for me. So I'm selfishly excited to talk about technology because I think both of us are deeply interested and passionate about this because it's not just about geeking out over technology, but it's also about what is that actually doing to us as human beings. And I think that's a really critical way of thinking and engaging, and especially during this time when all of our relationships now, with the exception of those who are most close to us, all of our relationships right now are being mediated by a digital technology over cameras and screens and stuff like that. So I thought it would be helpful for us to consider carefully how should we think about that? What should we think about what that's doing to us, and what lessons can we learn? So, and I think Omair is just the perfect conversational partner for that. So, just very briefly. That. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm excited. Just very briefly, I know a lot of Sparkers know you as Pastor Omair. You are on our pastoral leadership team. You help shape and guide the direction and leadership and give sermons. Fantastic contributions to the life of our church. However, that is not your day job. That is not your vocation. Would you mind sharing with everybody? And I actually was thinking about this. I know what your PhD is in, but I don't know what your graduate or undergraduate work was in, so I can't remember. So give just a very brief background to help set the stage, I guess.
Yeah, totally. So I am a consumer psychologist and a social psychologist. So my background is in it's in like behavioral sciences and social sciences broadly. I have degrees in communication and political science, but my PhD was in it was in consumer psychology at Stanford. And since then, I have worked as a behavioral scientist or consumer psychologist at Apple for 4 years, and then Netflix now for 2 years. So, this topic, for the angle that I'm coming at it from, one is obviously pastoral and theological, but another one too is it's about human behavior, why people do what they do, how we interact with each other, what influences the way we interact with each other, especially when there are high stakes on the line, like how we spend our money and how we choose entertainment, things like that.
Yeah, excellent. And just one last reminder for those of you who are now logging on and joining us, we're going to be taking some questions from all of you at the end. So if you have them, go ahead and throw them up on the comments, and we'll make sure that we get to those. Okay, let's start very high level, very simple level. What is technology? Because I think a lot of us, when we think of technology, we think about these digital devices. But I think it's helpful to start maybe with a more basic understanding of what technology is before we just simply jump to what we consider high tech and stuff. And I know what my definition or my understanding is, but I'd really love to hear you start off with that. Just basic, simple question. What is technology?
Yeah, that sounds great. And also for our viewers and listeners as well, this is a dialogue. So I have thoughts and questions for Kevin to address as well, which included I'd love to hear your take on it. So the way that I would think about it especially for like this kind of discussion, would be, technology would be tools that we use to help us do stuff. Like that's me using the ground level words for it. And then usually that's stuff. Right. Tools we use to help us do stuff, with usually there's an implication in there that the scientific process played a role in like developing that tool that we're using to do stuff. I think that's kind of how I think about it. How does that sit with the way you would think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. A tool is probably one of the most basic pieces. I think part of the definition that I've been wrestling with over the course of my study and thinking is that not only is technology a tool that we use to do stuff or accomplish things, but it's actually an extension of who we are. So there's a much more imbued sense of humanity within our technology. And the way that Marshall McLuhan, the famous media theorist, has kind of put it is that technology is in some ways an extension of ourselves. So you can think about the wheel as an extension of our legs, or one of the earliest classic examples of this is that the cooking pot is an extension of our stomachs. And then cameras are extensions of our eyes, and just goes on and on and on. So I think I would add that particular piece. And the reason why I think that is kind of important is because, and this might be we might be getting very quickly to the debate portion of our conversation. That understanding of technology for me has huge implications for who we are as people, the kind of humanity that we are, because the thesis is that as technology is developed, as we create these tools that we use, it doesn't just make life better, simpler, faster, more efficient. It actually changes who we are. And so I think we were starting to talk about this, and before we get too far down that road, I would love to hear your reflection on that. So while we might say that technology is morally neutral, we'll get to that, I suppose, later as well. Right. Like, what are the ethics around it? From a pure standpoint of biology and technology, there is a dynamic relationship between the two. And whenever we engage with the tool that we use, it's doing something to us. Marshall McLuhan's famous quip is that we make our tools and then our tools make us. And that includes our physiology, but also how we think and how we process, which is going to get down into how we theologize and create spirituality and stuff like that. So do you jive with that as well, or will you change that around a little bit?
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. The thing that I would still say that would be part of my definition is that those things that we make, they can change us. For me, a key question still boils down to, does it change us for the better or for the worse, or in a more nuanced way, in what ways does it change us for the better, and in what ways does it change us for the worse? The reality is you can say that about almost anything humanity creates, not just technology. You could say that about culture. Like, we create culture and then culture shapes us. You could say that about institutions and governments and organizations, right? We make them and then they take on personalities of their own and they shape us and our tribes and all of that. So, I mean, I think that that's true. I would say that that's true of everything in all those situations, and maybe this is part of the core of the disagreement. I would say that one should not immediately take a posture that just because it does, like, we've created something that then has a profound influence on us, that's inherently bad, or it makes us less human. Right. Or in any way. So yeah.
Right. Okay. So let's get to a classic story. I don't know how many Sparkers know this story, but I think it's a classic story that multiple theorists have used to illustrate this particular point. And then I think we do need to jump from what can we extrapolate from this story regarding what is beneficial and positive, because I think a lot of people in this disrupted times, and we'll get to some of these examples, are feeling a weight or an anxiety of relationships over mediated technologies. They feel a weight and anxiety about what social media is doing to us. So I think there is a tendency or a bias towards a negative interpretation. And so I think your counterbalance of let's be careful about the moral evaluation or the moral conclusion that we're making, and first start with an understanding. So I think maybe that's the trajectory of the conversation, and that's a little bit of where we left off last too, because I think I'm going to argue, I might argue that there might be a net negative regarding some of what's happening. You might argue for net positive. So we'll see where that goes. Okay.
Right.
The classic story for those who have familiar with this is that Plato tells a mythical story between a conversation between Socrates and Phaedrus. And the basic story goes that there's these two individuals in Egypt, and one of them invents a tool, a technology called writing. This is, of course, way back in the ancient world. And he comes to I think the king, I might be getting some of these details wrong, but comes to the governor or the king or the ruler and says, look at what I've created, this new invention called writing that's going to expand men's wisdom and expand men's memory. It's going to do these wonderful things. And the king or the governor replies, essentially, you fool, you don't know what you've actually created, because this system called writing is actually going to do the very opposite. You think it's going to increase our wisdom and increase our capacity for memory. And again, this is the ancient world where memory is critical for everything.
And oral communication was the way to communicate.
Yeah. But what you've actually created is a tool that is going to strip men, and I'm sorry I'm using the masculine pronoun, but that's kind of how the language goes.
They were sexist back then.
You're creating a technology essentially that's going to strip people of the capacity to be wise, and to even memorize. Their memories are going to be affected as a result of this. Now, I think it's very easy to make the correlation from that story all the way to, I have a cell phone, it's got all the phone numbers in there. I don't remember anyone's cell phone number or phone number anymore. I don't even remember, why should I remember everything? Because that thing has done it. I think that is the classic story that's used to illustrate that when we create a technology or a tool that we use that makes life simpler or easier for us, it makes things easier in one particular aspect, but it's actually doing something to us, like making Omair disappear. I know he's still there. He's got Omair
right.
Jr. to take care of.
Handed Junior off to mommy for bedtime.
But it's doing something to us. That can get extrapolated then to all sorts of negative things, such as social media is this great tool where we're connecting, but now we're no longer capable of having real life relationships. Okay, that's the basic premise, basic thesis. What say you, Dr. Omair, regarding the effect of this? What's your take on all of that?
Yeah, that's right. So I'm glad that you brought up that story, because you can take it in like two very different directions. So one story to place that Plato story would be what you just described, where it's like an example of this trajectory of the problem of mediated communication, that they're like, we always lose something in the process. And one could argue too that now, millennia later, we're only worse off than when Plato wrote that. This is the thing, though. I have a very different take on that story, because so one is like, if I remember right, in that story, like it's basically saying that written communication is worse than oral communication, because if we don't have to memorize things, in other words, if things are written down, then like people's memories will just disappear. There will be no like collective knowledge in our minds. And if I remember right, there was another part of it too, which is that you can't there's a problem with written communication because you can't really know what you're reading, because you can't dialogue with the writer. So it's a one-way communication. And
it's an argument. It's an argument about decontextualizing the communication. Like when we communicate face to face, there's so much wisdom that is embedded just in the face-to-face. And if you take that away, then yeah, you can't explain what is really written down. You can't really know. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And the reason I think it's interesting to pick that story is because I think we can, from human experience since then, speak to the reality of like, no, we're not going to ban writing. And writing and reading has been like one of the most significant contributions to like everything that it is to be human. And I know you're not going to hate on reading because that's basically that's your life. And so that like and that so this pattern of a new technology comes along and you can come up with reasons for why that new technology is going to be bad. And ultimately you have to see how that bears out. But to me, that argument, that debate that Plato is summarizing, that plays out over and over throughout history. Every time there's a new technology. There was, when written communication was king for communication in America, for example. We may remember the 1930s broadcast of War of the Worlds. Like the way this story goes is that newspapers were alleging that it caused mass panic in the nation, that people listened into this radio show and they actually believed that the world was being invaded by, I think it was Martians. But either way, so that's the story that we heard. At the time, it was supposed to argue that, look, radio is so sensationalist. How are people going to know anything for real? They're going to be easily swayed by this. That story in and of itself, the story of mass panic because of War of the Worlds is a myth in and of itself. Newspapers exaggerated the effect that story would have had on the public. And you realize in context, that was the newspaper industry feeling threatened by the radio industry. And then when TV came along, I remember there were media theorists who argued that, people who had a vested interest in radio, arguing that TV was so much worse because it's going to ruin our imagination, right? Like when you have to listen to a story, you come up with the world yourself, but TV just gives you the world and you don't have to think about it. And then for those people who grew up with TV, they would say the internet causes all sorts of problems because, it's instant gratification. Whereas with TV, you had less control over it and you have to wait for it. I don't know about you too, but I have people in my life of varying ages who basically, in romantic relationships, the medium of communication that was the one they used when they found their partner is the best one. And then everything that comes after that is the worst. I've had older people who grew up in the era of writing letters, tell me that phone calls ruined relationships because you no longer had to carefully form your thought.
Yeah.
And wait and think about what the other person was going to say. It was instant gratification. And of course, people who used to talk on the phone all the time say, oh, these kids getting romantic over text, that can't be real. That's not right. And then emojis and animojis and it's a devolution. So the point is I place that Plato story in this context of we of course we can come up with reasons why we should be afraid of the next thing that comes out, but humanity has persisted and relationships, many of them in many ways have flourished because of them. And so it's unfair to kind of discern what trajectory a technology is going to go on.
All right, so here's going to be my counter argument. Oh, I'm loving this so much. This is so great. I guess I feel like your evaluation of that story is more negative than it needs to be. I don't know, and I agree that the people that I've read that have used that story have used it in that way. So I want to concede that particular point. But as I read that story in its purest form, like maybe what the mythical character of Thutis was attempting to communicate, was just simply be wise about what this is going to do to you. And in many ways, even though people today, media theorists and journalists today, use that story to talk about technology negatively, in many ways, he was kind of right. Like, I don't use my memory in the same way. I don't use my stomach in the same way. For example, the reason why we have to cook our food now is because we've used the technology that has changed us. So the way in which our bodies, work in this world is different as a result of the modes of transportation that we've created and stuff like that. So I guess my take on it is, yes, we should be careful not to be negative immediately, or to use that story kind of as the prophetic call towards caution. But I do think that there's still something there. I guess two kind of examples come to mind. Our current, oh dear Lord, should I go here? Our current political process and system is, most people would argue, and I don't know if you would agree with this, but most people would argue has been extremely polarized. The exacerbation of false news and information, and the shift of authority as to what is true, no longer being with a sense of objective sense of truth, but now much more centralized within myself. What I believe happens to be true is true, and that does wreak real havoc in our civic discourse and in our political state of being. Many people would suggest that a technology, whether that be the algorithms that are running on Facebook, and the algorithms that I know that you also work with, are polarizing people towards their own penchants, towards their own desires, and filtering out anything that doesn't go to that. So the technology itself is providing a service, right? Let's be neutral. It's providing a service to who we are. But it is also changing us, is it not? Is it not changing the way we think about the world, how we engage with the world, and therefore how we make conclusions and make a sense of the world and worldview, and therefore how we actually make decisions in the voting booth, etc. So, yeah, give me your.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of what you said, I would resonate with. I agree that I think there's a lot of good evidence that show, coming from political psychology, that would show that we are more polarized, right? That people are in many ways, like within our own beliefs, that we're less likely to encounter people that are not like us in a lot of meaningful ways these days. So I think that that's true. I think, though, as well, like, so here, this is a thing that's part of the overall conversation. The thing that I try to avoid is, and economists sometimes joke about this too, that it's basically, we need to avoid the temptation where for everything that's wrong in society to blame the internet for it. Like, that's a very, very common thing to do. I absolutely agree, though, that the internet has played a role. So like, for sure, I will grant that, especially on Facebook, right? It has allowed for what we would call affinity groups, right? You
Right.
can connect with the people who, like it used to be that you had to connect with people by geographic location, right? And your neighborhood could be full of people who are somewhat different from you. But on Facebook, you can find your people who are exactly like you, and then it becomes an echo chamber. You only hear each other's thoughts, and that's absolutely a tragedy. I would agree with that. That's a problem. It has negative consequences. I think, though, what a lot of people forget is that technology, including Facebook, but just the internet and like a somewhat level of the democratization of information, has allowed people or forced people to be exposed to beliefs and perspectives in an unparalleled scale. Like, I was thinking about this, where just like a few generations ago, you could be a Southern Baptist living in central Illinois, and you could live your whole life possibly not meeting a non-Christian, maybe even a non-Southern Baptist, maybe somebody outside of your race or your cultural context. But like, if you think about kids who are growing up in America now, like who are 10 to 15 years old, that kind of world is impossible. Like especially if you think about like the religious market, they will be exposed to so many more beliefs and perspectives than even we would have a generation ago. And that's because of the internet. That's because of being able
Right.
to connect on social media. And I personally think, at least in that way, we're better off for that. Obviously, I don't like
Net
polarization.
positive.
That's a problem. Right. I would say that. And I mean, even in my own story, right? The reality, like for me becoming a follower of Jesus, like it required exposure to followers of Jesus in my physical network, but also like being able to look up stuff online, or,
Right.
that played a crucial role in it. People find new ideas, and our chat, like we push ourselves to think about things that we otherwise wouldn't have, because this kind of information is more available.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, you're touching on faith. I think that's great, and I actually think, as much as we debate, I think we have, there's a lot of synergy that we have
I
with
agree.
that is too. Because that's the thing that's so difficult about all this, and maybe one of the lessons that we're learning is, and this was something Tom said when we were talking about finances, is that the pain of the negativity is always stronger. And you as a social psychologist know this, right? The pain is always stronger and more influential in our thinking than the joy of any success or
Right.
compliment, right? And so whenever we see something negative about how the internet and social media is screwing everything, I mean, we naturally we have a bias towards that. By the way, I'm
Yeah.
totally interrupting the conversation. Why do we have a negative bias? What is that drives us towards that negativity?
Yeah. Yeah. So and in particular, that like what you were describing is called risk aversion. It's like a hallmark of behavioral economics research. But yeah, so there are like a few theories put forward for why there is like it's the way that social psychologists think about it is it's a disproportionate attention that we
Right.
pay to negative stimuli. And there's an evolutionary psychological explanation that when survival is on the line, being able to detect a threat is much more useful to you than
Right.
being able to detect something that's friendly. And then just over time, as we no longer are at risk for dying all the time, there are other things that other negative stimuli that we pay attention to and
Right.
give too much weight.
Yeah, this is one of the dilemmas that I've considered, is that the cultural evolution that we're going through is far faster than our biological evolution or our psychological evolution. And so even though the culture around us, the environment in which we live is vastly different, our fundamental underlying psychology is still the same. And so so we're having to do that. Okay, I'd like to shift to two specific areas that I think are going to be helpful. One is theology, deconstruction, and technology, and maybe help us understand a little bit of how all of what we've just talked about may have played a role in all that, to maybe bring some understanding. And then the second thing is parenting. And you're the parent of 4 little ones growing up in a deeply ubiquitous digital technology world. And I think it would be really helpful, given your perspective, to think about what are you doing and what do you think is actually wise? Because there's so much out there regarding what screens and blue light is doing to our kids, and the
Sure.
access and all that kind of stuff. So the first is then the theological piece. So one of the observations that I think some people have made is that, and like if we went back to Gutenberg's press, that formative technology that transformed the world, we immediately created a way of thinking about God and faith that was codified in a text. And a lot of people compare the linearity of the text and the orderedness and the sequentialness of a text, like it goes one right after the other, and it's linear and it's very formulated, with the development of things like systematic theology, which is very linear, very orderly. And then as digital technologies emerge, where nothing is ordered in that particular way, and everything is much more a web, it makes sense then that our faith expression would then also be influenced by that. Just a decade and a half, 2 decades ago, we had the emergence of the emerging church, rethinking everything and mushing old and new together. And now we're living through a time where many people, a lot of Sparkers, are going through what we've called deconstruction, where they're now questioning everything. And I guess my kind of my proposal would be that if we don't understand that the technology has done that, the internet has done that, the fact that we're now interconnected has done that, we may be missing a part of understanding that, and to bring some understanding to help bring us some peace about it all, I suppose. And I'd be kind of curious your take on all of that, and especially somebody with your faith background with such an amazing journey and diversity. So, am I onto something? Am I off? What do you think?
Yeah, I think for sure, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Like, there's no question that we invented a technology, the printing press, and then that the printing press, especially the way the Bible was constructed physically after that, had an effect on us. At the same time, though, like we create a lot of things like that, not just technology, that have also like come back at us. So, for example, we I think like within the emerging church deconstruction world, there's also talk about the effect that like church buildings have on people, right? Like there's the idea that, as you know, that culturally the Western church borrowed its structure from like a theater in the Greco-Roman world. And so that was like the beginning of shaping thinking of church on Sunday as a performance, with a performer on stage and a passive audience there to listen, right? These are cultural choices that we made that have had an impact. When one realizes this, though, right? Like, so I actually know, and I came from movements that would have said, oh, well, if you know that it has a like pagan or Greco-Roman influence, get rid of it. And so they would argue we can only meet in homes the way the early church did, because of this profound influence that culture has. But I think like what we would do, and what many of us who choose to meet in these traditional space settings, or if you're at Spark, you meet in a synagogue with those kinds of settings. We're doing a cost benefit analysis, right? We are acknowledging that yes, the structure of the space that we have affects us. And in some ways it will be negative, right? In some ways it will create this performance culture. But in some ways, it's very positive, and that's why we keep it the way that we do. And it's not like we would say just because it's new and that it has the ability to influence us, that it's inherently a bad thing. We would weigh it that way. And, even with the printing press too, like, I've heard theologians argue that when Bible verses got numbered, that was a significant difference in theological interpretation, because that paved the way to be able to proof text or find your specific verse to
Bumper
separate
sticker Christianity. Boom.
Exactly. And that, yes, right. Absolutely. That definitely has negative consequences. It also just allows people to reference passages more quickly and like make communication more efficient. And we do that when we preach and, or communicate. So, these are all like complicated things with pros and cons. And to me, technology is not different in that sense.
But okay, but wouldn't Jesus be upset with what we're doing with his movement by creating a performative? Like, he got in a boat and was surrounded, right? He needed a amphitheater off the natural hillside just to project, but to take a Greco-Roman style and create a performance, which also centralizes the pastor, right? The person who's doing the communicating, which is a completely different mode of operating in a theological or spiritual space, where in the ancient synagogue, the rabbi wasn't the center of attention. It was the word of God that was the center of attention, and the community surrounded. So even the building itself changes how we think. So what? So I'm being somewhat.
I know you are, but again, though, we have to acknowledge, right, that Jesus entered a world of many institutional structures that existed, and it's not like he like tore them down. In a lot of cases, he worked within them. And you could argue too that yes, the word of God was the center, but as soon as we had written word and literacy, it made the literate the powerful people in that situation, and the mediators. And I don't imagine Jesus being anti-literacy, but so again, even the Apostle Paul, right, spoke within these Greco-Roman contexts, right? He would go
Right,
to the
right.
Areopagus and talk the way they talked. The writer of Hebrews chose a rhetorical structure of communicating the good news in a way that was super common for the day, right? They
Well,
work within the systems that they have.
I also feel like many of our Christian, evangelical, theological, whatever, spiritual critics or critiquers, however you want to say that, are somewhat double-minded, like criticizing technology, but then praising the Romans roads that they created
Right.
for allowing, the
Yeah.
gospel to go forth. Okay, I was at a conference in 2000. Oh my goodness, 20 years ago. We're getting old. Where the emergence of the emergent church and technology and internet was just kind of coming online, and this was the statement that was debated: the message should never change, even though the methods do. And what I kind of wrestled with, and I really would want to hear your perspective, is I don't think that is possible. It feels to me, given that technology does affect how we think, how we process, how we theologize, that the message itself has to change, both to be relevant to the new culture, but also to have fidelity to the original intent as well, because the
Right.
original messaging has to change in order to kind of keep the fidelity, because it's in a new context. So people who are persistent, I suppose, in saying that the gospel message has never changed and should never change, I've really wrestled with that, because it feels like it should change, and it should become something new and fresh in each particular era and culture, and also it just naturally is going to change because of the mode in which the communication comes because of technology. What's your
Yeah.
what's your take on that?
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I think that it's naive to, in my opinion, to assume that, the world that you live in, whether it's technology or culture or whatever, won't change the way that you literally understand the good news, right?
Right.
It is like the way that I would think about it is that in that sense, there are so many things, including technology, they're the air that we breathe. We don't even think about it. We're not aware of the ways in which it has influenced our thinking. I often think too about how, like if you're growing up now, you have grown up in the West in a postmodern environment and in a Western environment, in an industrialized environment, and all of these things, they permanently affect how we understand the good news. And really, the only way often for us to get outside of it is to have somebody who is not from that world,
right,
like speak as a voice into us to hold us accountable. But when it comes to technology, it's so pervasive, especially in rich upper middle class areas that we live in, that who is going to offer a perspective that can rock your worldview. And again, that's what New Testament writers were doing. Like when they constructed the gospel accounts, and they were choosing for that to not just rely on oral tradition. They were committing this thing to writing. Their memory, how they constructed memory, played a role in how they wrote it. And there are permanent, lasting effects because of the choices that they made. And we have to do the same thing for ourselves today.
Right. Yeah. All right. Well, down with 20 years ago thinking.
Yeah, I would say, can I add, I think one thing is that it also speaks to that kind of criticism that it's one of actually saying resisting the influences that the outside world can have on the message. That approach is it's the same thing with culture. Like sometimes when some Christians say, well, we can't let culture influence our convictions. My response to that is, what do you mean culture? Like which culture and what influence and to what consequences? It is multifaceted, and you can't escape some aspects of it. And I would say the same thing with technology, right? Like these are related criticisms to me.
Well, and my theory of technology has expanded to include language, culture, governments, money,
Yeah,
clothes. I mean, all of that is a technology. All of those are technological developments that we've created to make our lives better, for us to do things,
sure.
for us to, organize ourselves and things like that. Okay, parenting. Um, I'm not exactly sure which question to even start with, because some of the simple questions are like, do I even let my kid on a device? And especially now that all of their schooling, and especially for those, um, who, well, I mean, even for those who have internet at home, my heart just is going. I'm sorry, I'm distracted because my heart is going out to all those kids who don't have internet at home, and they're
Right.
educational, right, in this particular time. So I've been just praying for them, and just been being burned about that. Okay, setting that aside for the sake of the conversation. Um, all the educational stuff is happening over Zoom or on the internet, and then entertainment and the constant you know uh, desire for eyeballs and clicks and things like that. Um, if we take a neutral approach, and maybe even kind of an Amish approach, which is sure, just let them go for it and then just evaluate later. Um, I think there's a lot of fear, and I think I have this still too, that especially in the most formative and the neurological formative years of my child's life, spent so much time, on a light emitting diode all the time. Um, what's how do you process that? I mean, you've got four little ones that you love and cherish, obviously, and want to see the very best. Like, how should we be thinking about that? Help me.
Sure. Yeah, no, totally. I mean, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it too. But really quick, sorry, when you said and to be Amish about it, did you mean the stereotype of the Rum Springer, where
Yeah.
you let them try it and come back? There's an irony in picking that example, because you could have picked the stereotype of, withdrawing from technology as well.
Right.
It was just
Right.
funny that you
Sorry.
picked that way to do it. No, it's fine. So I will preface this by saying, one, I'm not
We
an
should
expert.
probably we should probably say Omair and I are referring to a practice within the Amish community called the Rum Springer, which is
Right.
go out, experience the world for 2 years, and then come back and see if you want to rejoin the community. So that's right. Yeah.
Exactly. Which for Kevin is one of the options on the table for how to parent your child with technology.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's right.
no, so yeah, I mean, I think the reality is, I would have to caveat this with, I'm not an expert on parenting, and also I only know as much about parenting as my oldest child. So I have a 6-year-old, which means I can't I can't really tell you yet about like from experience what it's like to like monitor internet searches of my kids or things like that.
Right.
But there are some anchoring principles that I have for myself that I will put onto them as well. And that is, so one is like the way we often talk about it in our house is that the internet, the stuff on the internet is made by people, and people have different goals. They want you to do different things. And there are people who make really great choices with what they put out on the internet for you, and people who make really bad choices, just like they do in real life. And that just like how we try to protect the types of people that they're exposed to in the real world and the things that people put out there for us to consume in the real world, we try to do that, help them with that on the internet as well. We literally talked to Justice earlier today about this, because he just literally today learned how to do a Google search by
Oh
himself.
boy.
And he was looking at pictures of Scarlet Witch, which, it can range from very fun and positive and uplifting to not. And so like, but there, I mean, the reality is like, that's what the real world is like. Yes, it's closer, right? They have
Yeah.
easier access to it. But the posture that we would have is that we want to be careful, but we don't want to be dismissive of the medium. And we want to keep the focus on like, it's like people who are doing these things, and people make choices, and we want to understand those choices. That's also how I would look at it as a social psychologist as well. And that, yeah, I mean, that's that. Yeah.
You're not terribly concerned like with the physiological effects, like the constant streaming of light, the potential psychological effect of now mediating everything by your own self, rather than having to do that through physical relationships and things like that. I mean, those are some of the kind of the effects of technology. It's not just content, it's the actual medium itself. I mean, that's Marshall McLuhan's argument, is the medium is the message. And so if I get to do it myself, then there's a much more narcissistic tendency that develops. And
yeah, no, it's right. And I think we should absolutely be on the lookout for those potential effects. And there is something to, like a habit loop, like where feedback is instant all the time, and you're not patient. At the same time, though, I do carry skepticism of, like our arguments that because of mediated technology, our attention spans have gotten so much shorter and all of that. And I actually I would question the reliability of those findings that measure how much shorter it has. But I would also say that like what I would be asking is, to what consequence? Because the reality is Justice is going to live in a world, that's our son is going to live in a world where iPads and Google searches exist, and everybody accesses information that way, including me. That'll always be around him. So to me, the posture has been, and it's subject to change because I'm only 6 years into parenting, but it's been that we try to see how we can make the best of the technology or work through the technology, rather than a posture of avoidance or something like that. Yeah.
I just need to let you know that our wives are having a conversation right now. Christine says, I just want to clarify that Justice did not learn how to do an internet search by himself. My wife says he's a genius. So anyway, that's what's going on in the comments right now.
How did then? You know what? I'll need to ask Christine afterwards how he found images of Scarlet Witch.
We're starting to come to the end, and I didn't give you much chance to ask me questions, so you can interrupt me at any time. But I think part of what I also wanted to get to is if I can summarize kind of my takeaways. There's always going to be effects of technology on us. But what you constantly bring to my thinking about it, which I appreciate, is a much more sober-minded perspective, to be very careful not to allow the negativity bias to overwhelm or to rule the day. Is that there's far more wisdom and understanding that we need to have. I mean, all of this is, in the history of evolution, this happened like a snap second ago, right? This is all brand new to us, so we are still learning, and we don't have to be so negative all the time. I think I would still argue that being attentive is still wise. In all of that.
I agree. And I think that's where there's substantial agreement between us, right? Whereas I would agree that being attentive is the way forward, and to be open to positive and negative consequences. And the only way we're going to realize those is by thinking very critically about it. And that's why too, I always appreciate your voice in this, because you're having this perspective amidst Silicon Valley, right? Like in 2020. Yeah. And there's no question that in the air that we breathe around here, I would say there's a default premise that that technology is good. In fact, that it has the ability to cure everything or solve everything. Right. And that kind of technological determinism, right? The idea that technology can determine our future in such a unilateral way is very harmful. And you bring up great hypotheses to me all the time about the ways in which it can be harmful, and to think through that.
Yeah. Okay. What should followers of Jesus really consider then when paying attention to this? I want to keep us grounded in our ultimate mission, to inspire people to actually live the way of Jesus. So how do people live this way in a world that's saturated by all of this technology, and what should we be attending to?
Yeah, totally. So I'll answer that, and then I think we'll have time to close. I have a question for you that I think would be a good one to end with. So I would say two things. One is that, and this actually I saw this from a comedian named Adam Conover, who pointed out that like a helpful approach towards everything that is that's on Google and Facebook and YouTube and just online, and all of these algorithms that are trying to understand us and trying to influence us and manipulate us, is to take an approach of being mindful of your clicks, right? Like mindful of where your eyeballs go on a screen, where you scroll. And this can fit into even just spiritual discipline practices. We are so used to navigating our computers so fast that we don't often pause to consider that for literally every picture that you click on, or every article that you open, every scroll that you do, there is a system that is learning you, that is trying to influence you. And you can choose what you want, what do you want to communicate to yourself, to the system, to the world around you. These algorithms are only as good as the humans who make them and the human behavior that they train on, right? We have an opportunity when we navigate the internet to choose to be different and choose to be mindful. So just practice that. Yeah. See what happens.
I want to interrupt you and emphasize that point, because I think when people hear algorithms, they think about this machine that's doing something to us, but we don't recognize that we are actually feeding the machine the content, the data, right?
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly right. If humans are racist, algorithms will be racist too. There's a lot of evidence that suggests exactly that. And then an overarching theme that I would take too is the way that I think about technology in just a broad level is the way I think about culture. Various Christians at various times have taken different attitudes just wholesale towards culture. And you could think the same with technology, right? One attitude is withdrawn. That it is the enemy, and the best thing you can do is separate yourself from it. And I think that's problematic. Another attitude is against, right? That this is something that you commit to engaging with, but you engage with it to fight against it. I have found that the far more useful approaches are to work within culture and within technology and through, right? Is to work through these things that exist, that are in the air we breathe, for the sake of humanity, for the sake of the kingdom. Those are the two big takeaways.
Yeah, that dovetails exactly into kind of how I would answer the question. I mean, one of the fundamental principles of McLuhan's thesis is that the medium is the message, and the content takes the shape of the medium that you put it in. And part of the story and the message that Christianity and the way of Jesus has promulgated is that the message came in a medium of human flesh. I mean, the idea of incarnation is the idea that God actually changed mediums in order to communicate God's love for this world, to transform that, and then commissioned us to be that medium to the world. So I kind of think that as we dig into technology theory and philosophy and all that kind of stuff, it constantly brings me back to, if technology is really an extension of humanity, the more that we study technology, the more we understand it, the more we actually understand who we are and what does it mean to be human, and then what does it mean to be created in the image of God, and then how can we better then leverage ourselves to incarnate. I think I might have some other thoughts regarding fragmentation and centralized authority and all sorts of other things, but I think I would probably sum it up right there.
Yeah.
Regina has some amazing suggestions online. So those of you who are watching, Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport it would be another one. And there's, of course, lots of book recommendations. And Mind F asterisk CK, if you want to learn about Cambridge Analytica. So for those of you who are online and want to some of that stuff out. Any final closing comments as
Yeah.
we come to the
Well,
end of our time, or
sure.
please?
I wanted to ask you, and because this will tie into what you choose to do after this. So, like like I've heard you say things like, you're like technology, the effect on humanity can have a net negative like outcome. You've used that phrase at various times, but in terms of like practical, like things that affect your life, I'm curious how you think about your own online ministries in that broader context. So, for example, you have a blog. You have a podcast for the church. We do conversations like these, which you might continue to do even after shelter in place is gone. You are on Facebook, or at least you have been at times, sharing ideas, engaging with people, or at least you were. But this is what I think it would be helpful for viewers to know is like, well, how are you making the decision? Like, what's in your decision calculus? How are you deciding among all of these ministries that you do whether it's worth it, like whether it's a good thing that you're doing these things, or whether you should just, stop, like you should not be on Facebook, you should not have a blog, or you should not do YouTube live conversations. Like, how do you think about yourself within your own often negative framework?
Oh man, I don't like that you asked me that question. Yeah, I have mentioned net negative, but if I were to say net negative, I'm looking at like, I don't know, 1 to 2% net. Like if we're on the 51-49, it wavers back and forth. And so I've really had a love-hate relationship with my own wrestling, to be honest with you, because and this is why I love talking with you about it, is because I don't know exactly why necessarily I feel net negative, except keeping my own psychology in check and recognizing that I am drawn. Like I read Liliana Mason's book, Uncivil Agreement, regarding our current political context. I mean, it's just, I don't know if I should say this, but it's horrifying. I mean, what the divisions in our nation are doing to our civic discourse and actual policies on the ground and how people vote and stuff like that, and misinformation and things like that. It's really hard for me not to connect Facebook algorithms to the development of that process, while at the same time recognizing that good friends of mine, family members of mine, are on Facebook making incredible connections and influencing people in that particular way, and keeping in touch, and seeing pictures of loved ones and things like that. So yeah, I don't like that you asked me that question, because I don't have a good answer for you. I ditched Facebook because of some of this thinking and process. And to be honest with you, I don't know if that's been a net positive or a net negative. I feel like it's been a net positive for me, because just from a pure personal standpoint, because of the time that I'm spending. Like I'm no longer scrolling through Facebook, and I'm about ready to get rid of my Twitter account too, because I don't really scroll through that as well. And I'm not good at those platforms. I mean, like, some people are really good at social media, and I am just not good at it at all. But you also mentioned podcasts, conversations like this, and I feel like, one of the things that technology does that you point out is that it's a great surrogate for when there isn't the real life possibility. And we have Sparkers all over the nation, quite literally, who have been a part of our community, moved away, and they keep in touch with us in that way. And I find that a great surrogate when they can't be in the room. So I see a lot of positive in that. But I also know that, well, you and I both do pretty visually heavy sermons, and you just miss that on the podcast. You miss the smiles and the laughter and the breathing of the people around you that you're sitting with when you're in a service. Those are stripped away through the technology. So even though I do that, I still have this wrestling. So I don't think I'm answering your question very well. I think everything is wrestled with constantly for me.
Yeah,
and which is why I love doing these conversations.
This is exactly what I wanted you to say. So I'm glad you got that out for our listeners.
You got what you wanted. Great.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay. Uh, I hope some of this was helpful for all of you, for all of our Sparkers, and then anybody else who happens to be watching. Obviously, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so many more books and nuances and avenues that we could go down. But it was, selfishly, this was just a lot of fun. I love bantering and wrestling with these ideas with you, Omair, and you're such a gift to me personally, and you and your whole family is such a gift to our community. So thank you so much for taking some time out and chatting with us.
Okay. Totally feel the same way, brother.
Okay. All right, everybody. That's the last of our currently scheduled conversations for our disruptive times. I would love to hear your feedback. Just like Omair was saying, is this a net positive or a net negative? Because we may, like Omair mentioned, we may continue these. We don't know. We want to be helpful, and we want to add value to our community and to the internet out there. We want to influence those algorithms in a positive way. So let us know. Have a great night, and we'll see you hopefully on Sunday. Bye, everybody.
Bye.